Okay, so the second topic here is let's talk a little bit more about observations in groups and how to take different approaches to modeling this kind of data structure. And the Korean drama ratings example that we saw earlier is an example of observations in groups, because you have, well, I show you a specific case of only the KBS drama. And even within the KBS dramas themselves, you can see the 4 different schedules. So we have ratings of dramas that are classified or grouped based on their scheduling. But at the same time, if you actually want to do a little bit more about this data set, like I said, there are 2 other different broadcasting companies as well. So there's another grouping going on if you want to take into account that as well. So you can see that the data, this particular data and many data out there could be pretty rich in terms of the information that they contain. All right, so observations can arise in groups. Examples is, for example, what we saw here about the ratings of dramas of different schedules. So that's the group is the scheduling itself. We can also consider like students test score from multiple schools. So that's where like the school is the grouping level, and then ratings of movies of different genres. So that's just another example. And I think if you look, many cases become, as you can see, observations in groups that are pretty common out there. So let's talk about how we want to develop the model, and then a little bit of notation so we're on the same page. We're gonna label the outcome variable as the Yij. Okay, so you can see that capital Y is what we usually do, a random variable. And in addition to only an index I, which is what we did before, for example, the normal example and all that, we're including another index called J. Okay, so Ij over here, J is the group index, okay, and I is the observation index within group J. Okay, so I use this little nj to represent the number of observations in group J. So I goes from 1 to nj, and then j goes from, I think, in our case, 1 through 4, but you can also use generic notation from 1 to capital J, something like that. Okay, so this is in addition to what we used to have. We used to have yi, I goes from 1 to n, where n is the total number of observations. But here we're trying to label the data in a particular way to represent that the observations are indeed in groups. And then the group is being indexed by J, and then I is still the observation index, but it goes from a particular range now, depending on which J you're looking at. All right, so since the outcome is continuous, let's start with the normal model, because we are hopefully very familiar with it by now. And I'm gonna propose 2 approaches based on what we have done so far or your previous stats course experience. The first approach is, well, we can use separate estimates. I'm just gonna model Yij with a normal model with very specific mu j and sigma j. So mu j is the mean for group J, and then sigma j is the standard deviation for group J. And you can see that the indexing goes as I from 1 to nj, and then small j goes from 1 to capital J. Okay. A second approach over here, which is also possible, is well, how about I want to consider all of the data points in one big group. This is what we call combined estimates. So in that case, we are looking at a single normal model, mu sigma. So equation 3 is actually pretty similar to what we have done in that chapter for the normal model. But here we still have this Yij notation just to indicate that we have this kind of data structure. So given this is on page 11 of the slide. And I would say, let's go back to the breakout rooms and talk a little bit with your members to comment on pros and cons of each approach. And you can talk about it generically, saying that when you have observations in groups, approach 1 versus approach 2, what are the pros and cons? You can also comment on specifically for this K-drama rating example, because we have seen the exploratory data analysis earlier, and you might want to discuss, well, if we have to choose between 1 or 2, which one might be a little bit more suitable than the other for our K-drama data set. Okay, so this is slide number 11, and I will pause recording and then invite you back in about 3 minutes from the breakout room. All right, any thoughts about pros and cons of each approach, and maybe specifically for our K-drama data set, and maybe generically just about observations in groups in terms of modeling approach strategy? You can just directly unmute because I might not be able to see everyone in my screen. That would be nice to hear from some of you to report back what you discussed, and you can also share any kind of questions you might have as you discussed with within your group breakout. Anyone?
One thing our group talked about was for approach 2.
Yeah.
You don't really have to worry about the sizes of the subgroups, and that kind of is relevant to our data set because we saw that Friday only had like 3 observations. So you don't have to worry about that if you do approach 2. But we also talked about how it doesn't really matter in this case, but independence across subgroups might not always be true. Like,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, elaborate a little bit more.
Like we were just talking about how in subgroups, everything might be independent, but the textbook was also saying that like across the individual subgroups, observations might not always be independent from each other.
I see. Yeah, good point. Yeah, so if we look at equation 2 and 3 just as they are, we're doing this IID. So when we say IID, is identically and independently distributed. So in equation 2 for approach 1, it's IID within each group, right? And then that's it. Whereas in equation 3, this assumption, if we're doing approach 2, then it's saying that not only within, but also across the groups that the observations are independent. So whether those are justifiable, right, will be definitely something to keep in mind, right? Great, and I'll also just mention a little bit as well, because Alex mentioned the group size, or I should say the sample size is pretty small in one of the 4 groups, and we saw the spike and everything, very small standard deviation and all that. And you all probably know before taking our course that when sample size is small, the classical or frequentist method might not work as well, and that's another reason why people would like to take the Bayesian approach a little bit, because it doesn't, hopefully not as affected by the sample size as much, but nevertheless it's still going to have a higher variability, even if we're doing within the Bayesian context when the sample size is small. But small sample size definitely can pose a issue as we move along. So that might be an argument for approach 2, specific for our case. So thanks, Alex. Anyone else? Anyone would like to go with approach 1 for our data set instead of approach 2? Or we all think 2 is probably the better one to go? Any thoughts?
2 has the problem of just not caring. It's as if you didn't have groups.
That's right. Yeah. So number 2 is totally ignoring the groups and all that. And also related to our own data set, we probably noticed that the sample size, especially for the group 3, I think is pretty small. But also, if we look at the mean and the standard deviation and all that, there's certain variability across the groups. Okay, so if we just lump everything into a big group and do approach 2, we might not be able to capture those. And it's highly possible that the ratings do vary a lot within the schedule. And if we do approach 2, it doesn't capture as much. But then approach 1, if you do that, just like Alex pointed out earlier, then, well, you only have 3 data points for one of the groups, and then it will be really hard to deal with it no matter what. So I'm gonna check the chat really quick. Okay, so Koji is saying I'm into approach 1. Seems like the causes of viewership are different depending on the day, so we should expect the distributions to be different. And low end seems fine, just rely more on priors. Okay, yeah, so that's a good comment as well. Yeah, so I think what Koji was saying in the chat is similar to what we were talking about earlier, because the 4 different groups do behave quite differently. I mean, the ratings themselves. And for small sample size, low end, we can probably rely more on priors and all that. So that's a really great comment, because for Bayesian method, we definitely want to, not only use the data itself, but also use the prior to influence certain things. So we're going to see how that can be done specifically for this data set, as well as generally for hierarchical modeling. And so thank you all for sharing. Let me, I guess, show a little bit of what we were talking about earlier. Just to summarize, approach 2 ignores the differences between groups, but then approach 1, I guess one extra, let me add one extra caveat over here about approach 1 is that we are having a group specific mu j and also a group specific sigma j. And when that happens, I think we are not borrowing any information or making any connection between the groups. And then just to reiterate what's talked about earlier, groups with small size might suffer from the high level of uncertainty. Well, regardless of what kind of prior use, but prior can help, which we will see as well. Then, of course, we're going to talk about, like I said, the lecture itself is what we call hierarchical modeling. So we're actually going to try something in between the two approaches. We're not entirely taking approach 1 or entirely taking approach 2, but something in between that we can still, respect the fact that observations could be quite different within each of the schedule or each of the groups that we're identifying over here. But at the same time, we're trying to borrow information across the different groups so that, the sample size small, when the groups with small sample size can also, borrow some information from the other groups that we can make a little bit more refined inference over there. And the general strategy is called hierarchical modeling. And I'm going to show you more about why we call it that way and how to set it up in JAX and all that. Okay. So with that,